As we just heard, Pope Francis taking time during his visit to the Good Samaritan home to acknowledge and offer prayers to the Catholic community in the Philippines, the site of two bombings, a double bombing at a Philippine cathedral. The bombers targeting a Sunday Mass where the prayerful were most vulnerable. Right now, reports have us looking at a significant loss of life, 20 people so far. Of course, we continue to follow the story for any updates about the number of victims that may have been lost. All of this, of course, is according to Police Director Graciano Mijares. He is head of the Philippine National Police. It's an autonomous region in Muslim Mindanao. The first of the twin bombings was inside the Jolo Cathedral, the second targeting soldiers nearby who had rushed to help those victims from the first bombing. Of course, this is a story that we continue to follow, but very direct and very specific reference by the Holy Father during his Angelus. We are definitely doing our best to get you, our viewers, as much information about this. We have with us John Allen, who is the editor of Crux, ready to speak with us about his thoughts about this. John, thank you so much for being with us. As you know, this region has been plagued with violence between Muslims and Christians for decades, and today a culmination on this day where they targeted a Sunday Mass of that type of contentious relationship. What more can you tell us?
Well, hey, Liz. So this attack took place on the southern Philippine island of Jolo. So the Philippines, of course, is an overwhelmingly Catholic country. It's actually the third largest Catholic country in the world after Brazil and Mexico. But there are a few islands in the south of the country. The Philippines is, of course, basically an archipelago that are overwhelmingly Muslim, and that has been home for the better part of 3 decades to a militant Islamic organization called Abu Sayyaf, which is basically the Filipino equivalent of Al-Qaeda or ISIS, which is looking to overthrow the Filipino government and to establish a kind of Islamic theocracy in that southern portion of the country. And has long made a habit of targeting Christians, whether Christian churches, Christian schools, Christian workplaces, and so on. This is one of the more brazen attacks that has taken place in the Philippines. We're talking about 2 bombs that went off in the Cathedral in Jolo. So far, the death toll is about 20 people killed, more than 80 wounded. Unfortunately, Liz, this is a very familiar global pattern. When Christians are targeted, it is often in their places of worship, and it is often on Sundays, because that, of course, is when Christians gather to worship. The Filipino authorities have vowed that they are going to be investigating this and launching a kind of aggressive manhunt, although we should say that relationships between the church in the Philippines and President Rodrigo Duterte are not especially positive right now. Duterte sort of ran against the authority of the church, and he has made a point of sort of positioning himself as an opponent of clerical authority. So I think a lot of people will be watching to see whether the government follows through, but they have vowed to try to bring the perpetrators of this attack to justice as quickly as possible.
John, I want to bring in my 2 co-hosts here, which is Father Gerald Murray and Ed Wilkinson, editor emeritus of The Tablet, who I know you know well, and I want to invite them to be part of this discussion. Gentlemen, please join in.
Yes, well, John, of course, the most perturbing or distressing thing, apart from killing people, is killing them in church. And this is a real sign of religious animus against the Catholics, and to take a house of worship and turn it into a slaughterhouse really shows the depth of violence that is inspiring this type of activity, which most people now assert is a terrorist act.
Well, I mean, it's clearly a terrorist attack. I mean, what strikes me, of course, is how people can be surprised by this kind of thing. I mean, I did a book, now it's almost 10 years ago, called The Global War on Christians, which was precisely about the scourge of anti-Christian violence around the world. I mean, I have been in parishes and in churches all around the world that have suffered this kind of assault. And the tendency in the West remains to think that this is somehow exceptional, that it is sort of random and unfortunate, but not part of a larger pattern. That simply is not true. We live in a world in which Christians are, by some order of magnitude, the most persecuted religious group on the face of the planet. And these kinds of assaults, which are driven both by religious hatred, but often also by political and economic grievances, this is simply part of the warp and woof of the world in which we live in. Obviously, there is an indictment to be leveled here against the Filipino government. I mean, the Filipino state has known for decades that it has a cancer metastasizing in its midst in the form of the Abu Sayyaf Islamic organization. And for a variety of different reasons, they have kind of allowed it to continue to fester. And now the bill for that inattention is coming due. But I think that the broader point here is that this kind of thing ought to be a wake-up call, that if we want to be serious about wanting to live in a world in which religious freedom is the order of the day, then in a particular way, the protection of vulnerable Christian minorities in places such as southern Philippines has got to become an international priority.
Mm-hmm. John, this is Ed. The Holy Father used Los Angeles to pray for a number of hot spots around the world, the Philippines, of course, and Brazil, Mexico, Colombia. But it was also the first time that publicly, I believe, that he's mentioned Venezuela on this trip. What did you make of that?
Well, I think Francis probably felt that he could not come to Latin America and be completely silent about Venezuela. I mean, I think we all know the story that Venezuela is locked in a political crisis that has been unfolding for some time now. And whatever one makes of the rights or wrongs, whatever attitude one wants to take towards the government of Nicolas Maduro or the political opposition there, the fact of the matter is that ordinary Venezuelans are paying the price. I mean, the statistics here are staggering. The ordinary Venezuelan has lost, depending on the estimates you look at, somewhere between 12 to 15 pounds over the last year simply because of food shortages. I mean, it's not like there is a national, fitness craze. But the fact of the matter is food is in short supply, electricity is in short supply. Hospitals struggled to come up with the medicine that they need to take care of patients. The government, for various reasons, because it doesn't want to admit the depth of the humanitarian crisis, has prevented or at least made it very difficult for NGOs and other humanitarian organizations to operate in the country. And all of this has had the effect of making life extraordinarily difficult. Infant mortality is shooting through the roof. Youth unemployment is above 70%. And I think the Pope, any Pope, of course, would be concerned with that, but I think history's first Latin American Pope feels a special responsibility to try to address that. Of course, as you know, the Pope's Secretary of State, his top diplomatic aide, Italian Cardinal Pietro Parolin, prior to that gig, was the Pope's ambassador in Venezuela, and feels a special closeness to that country as well. So I think the Vatican under Francis is extraordinarily engaged in what's happening in Venezuela, and I think Francis wanted to use the opportunity of being reasonably close to the country to let ordinary Venezuelans know that they are on his mind and in his heart.
Yes, John, and another thing that was very striking in the Pope's remarks after the Angelus was that he referred to the victims of the recent terrorist attack in Colombia at the military cadet training center, the police cadets, and that he named them one by one and gave a salute of reverence to them. That was very striking.
Yeah, I mean, Colombia is another place, of course, where Francis has been extraordinarily involved in the peace process. I mean, when the deal between the government of Juan Santos and the FARC, that is the main guerrilla organization in Colombia, was being negotiated, to bring an end to what had been the world's longest-running civil war. I mean, it was more than 70 years old at the time that deal was signed. Francis was engaged in telephone diplomacy. It later emerged that he was on the phone to President Santos roughly once a week, getting updates on the process, providing input, and so on. And of course, Francis wanted to go to Colombia to celebrate the signing of the peace deal, and still has the intention of doing that at some point. And so I think it was completely natural that, especially while he was in Latin America, that there would be a particular reference to the Colombian situation as well.
John, I know you said that what happened in the Philippines today is really part of a pattern of persecution of the church, and we should be aware of this. But was there any particular happening recently that set this particular terrorist act in motion?
Well, often when these things happen, it's because there is sometimes the logic is calendrical. It happens to fall on a day that is of particular significance to a local Islamist organization, or sometimes it's because that there was some perceived provocation. Now, in this case, I think it's a little too early to say exactly why this took place today. But I think the main point here is that none of us should be surprised that this kind of thing happened. I mean, we know that globally speaking, that there is a ferocious campaign of hatred against religious minorities of all sorts. But because Christians are simply more numerous and they're more scattered around the world, Christians in particular tend to be targets of this kind of thing. And in the Philippines specifically, we have known for a long time that Abu Saif is a real and present danger. And the Filipino government over the years has alternated between attempted crackdowns on these kind of groups and then a sort of nod and wink pattern of tolerance because it's simply easier. When President Duterte was elected, he vowed to wipe out Abu Saif within 60 days. Well, I mean, quite clearly that hasn't happened. And I think that pattern of neglect and the refusal to expend the kind of resources it would take to provide real security for religious minorities in the southern Philippines. I mean, basically speaking, this is the inevitable outcome of that kind of thing. And what one would hope is that in the wake of this kind of thing, the international pressure on the Filipino government to get serious about providing that kind of security would be irresistible.
All right. Our thanks, as always, to John Allen for joining us, providing us with keen insight and perspective, not only about these perilous situations in Philippines where it is reported 20 people have been killed in a cathedral explosion, but of course, your insight as well about Colombia and Venezuela, John Allen. Thank you. We appreciate your time